Good afternoon. Welcome to our final panel. This panel is on economic prospects for space settlement. The reason I saved this panel for the last session of the last day of the conference is because economics, I think, is really the wrap-up and in some ways the key to everything we want to do with space settlement. There are a lot of problems, a lot of unsolved questions in terms of the technology, the habitat design, transportation, resources, biology and life sciences especially. But the most important problem, I believe, is the economic problem. Because the fact is, if we had solved the economic equation, if it was obvious to everyone that you could make money doing this, then those other problems would be solved in very rapid order. Now, when we talk about the economic problem, there are a couple of basic levels. There's the near-term problem, and right now everyone is very optimistic about what NASA is doing, going back to the moon, how we're going to have this gateway station, we're going to have lunar landings again, and there's going to be great opportunity for entrepreneurs and new companies under NASA's wing, and that may or may not happen. NASA will do what NASA chooses to do and what the politicians choose to fund, and we can never predict the politicians. But there are certain things that we need to do in order to make settlement happen. If NASA is going our way and NASA is funding the things that we need, then that's great. If not, then we need to find some other way of making that happen. In the long term, NASA is going to be a small part of what's ultimately going to be happening in space settlement. I hear Elon Musk talk about putting 1 million people on Mars, and he says that, well, NASA is going to be a big part of that. Well, the reality is NASA is not going to be a big part of that. If you have 1 million people, you're not going to have NASA employing more than a very small fraction. You know, I can imagine a scenario where NASA would like to have 100 scientists on Mars feeding data and results back to thousands of scientists on Earth. You know, maybe in your wildest imagination, you might imagine that they might want to have 1,000 people there, but 1 million? NASA doesn't have 1 million employees on Earth. When you talk about having thousands or millions of people in space, we're going to need some sort of market beyond NASA. There has to be a commercial, industrial customer out there, preferably multiple customers, or possibly the military may also be involved. If you look at settlements on Earth, everything has been driven by a combination of commercial and military interests. We have cities on Earth with names like Fort Worth, Fort Wayne, Fort Lauderdale, which started out as military installations. But our cities are located where there's a strategic interest, either in terms of business or in terms of the military. We look at the military and we can ask ourselves, what are the future missions going to be in space? What is the military going to be doing out there which might generate demand? And there are a lot of near-term possibilities. You know, we have a lot of talk now about the Space Force, but still you have to ask yourself, is there anything that the military might do which would generate a mission large enough to sustain an O'Neill colony with 10,000 people? You know, maybe someone has an answer to that question. The only thing I can come up with is that their primary involvement would be defending the colony itself. But of course, you can't go to a business interest or a politician and say, you know, the military should finance this 10,000 person settlement so that it has something to defend. So again, you know, we come right back to the idea that there has to be a commercial market. Now, if you go back to the original high frontier concept from Gerard O'Neill, of course, the original concept was focused on the idea that the market would be created by space solar power, which unfortunately did not occur. It's been 50 years now that we're still waiting for it to happen. It may happen soon, but the problem was that was a single point failure. And that's something that we really need to guard against happening again. We don't want to depend on having one single market to promote space colonization and space settlement and be our economic driver. But we have Dr. John Mankins, who's one of the leading experts on space solar power. I'd say perhaps the leading expert at this point. So, John, I'd just like to ask you some questions. I mean, is space solar power something that's still viable and relevant today?
So I tend to agree with Jim Logan's observation in the previous panel that it was an error to attribute to a solar power satellite industry jobs for hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of individuals in space. I think the advances in technology that have occurred since the 1970s make space solar power for Earth and for use in space almost infinitely more feasible, more technically tractable and economically viable than it was in the 1970s. At that time, a typical solar power satellite in the 1979 reference system was about the size of Manhattan Island and would have been a single object of some 100,000 tons approximately, if you set aside some of the errors in the calculations of the time. And it would have cost about $1 trillion to get to the first kilowatt hour. Numbers like that in the era before the first space shuttle had launched made solar power satellites far from obvious to policymakers and budget decision makers of the day. Since then, if you look at advances in artificial intelligence and electronics, solid-state electronic power amplifiers, as a simple example, have gone from 20% efficiency to 80% efficiency for the wireless power transmitter on board the platform. Solar power generation, solar cells have gone from 10% efficiency for high-value applications to 40% and more. Robotics have gone from very, very narrow automated machines and teleoperated machines in the late 1970s to fully automated and intelligent warehouses where robots wander about with a minimum of human supervision. And in the last 8 years, a couple of small firms, SpaceX and Blue Origin as example, have taken the cost of launch down by a factor of 5 or 10. So in all of those areas, solar power satellites are not just more feasible, they are drastically more feasible both technically and economically than they have been previously. However, those same forces that make them now economically very viable, very promising, also mitigate against the involvement of large numbers of individuals in space working on a solar power satellite industry.
So what does a modern solar power satellite concept look like? I mean, if we're no longer talking Manhattan Island, is it something that requires large construction in space, or are we going to launch it in one piece on a Blue Origin New Glenn?
So for the most part, the physics of wireless power transmission take you in the direction of wireless beaming of microwaves in order to avoid the effects of weather and moisture in the air on higher frequencies. That means that the size of an antenna is on the scale of a human hand, 10 to 12 centimeters typically. However, the sheer size of the solar power satellite is still going to be extremely large. I think on the screen behind me is a artist's illustration of a recent type of solar power satellite, one that I invented several years ago, called solar power satellite by means of arbitrarily large phased array. The pieces of the solar power satellite of this architectural approach are quite small, meaning they're about the individual piece is about the size of a human hand, but it requires a close integration of PV, electronics, and RF transmitter on the platform in space. So you have an extremely large object in the illustration, which is shown. The transmitter is the disk. That object is on the order of 1 to 1.5 kilometers in diameter, and it comprises 1 million panels about the size of a coffee table. So you have both a very, very large number of pieces, very close integration of PV and electronics, so you don't have huge power distribution in space, but it still requires a very large object because you want to use frequencies that will pass with very, very high efficiency through atmospheric gases, water vapor, and weather.
And what sort of scale are we talking about in terms of megawatts, in terms of dollars?
So this system in particular, this particular concept is each platform would deliver about 2.1 gigawatts. You may recall that the reference systems of 1979, 1980 were looking at 5 gigawatt systems with fairly high power densities. This is a somewhat larger array, transmitter array, but the power levels are significantly lower, 2 gigawatts delivered rather than the previous 5 gigawatts delivered. And just for reference, making a virtue out of necessity, this kind of architecture for the solar power satellite, because it involves, it's like a coral reef. So coral as an individual animal is almost too small to see, but there are many, many trillions of them in the Great Barrier Reef. Similarly, in an SPS alpha, you have millions of small toaster-sized pieces. But because of that, you have the opportunity for exceptionally low-cost mass production of those pieces in terms of the economics. As a consequence, rather than $1 trillion to get to the first solar power satellite, depending on the price that one gets charged by either Blue or SpaceX, the potential is for a cost of electricity, levelized cost of electricity, between 3 and 7 cents per kilowatt hour delivered from these kinds of solar power satellites for an investment of about $10 or $11 billion for the first platform.
Eva Jane Lark is a vice president with NBO Nesbitt Burns. Eva Jane, what is your opinion? Do you think this is something that would be of interest to investors?
First of all, BMO Nesbitt Burns, and I'm definitely here on my own interests, as everyone else has said in their disclaimers, so the disclaimer stands as well. Actually, I worked with John on the 2007 space-based solar power study that the Department of Defense did, and I wrote the business case scenario for it then. And in my opinion, at that point in time, did not close, except for potentially very specific situations. First of all, I thought that this would be maybe the most pessimistic panel, but after Jim's presentation, I'm not sure if it'll quite be that. But I think that Jim's presentation still comes into the discussion of space-based solar power, because while they've done lots of experiments that say that it's safe, we don't necessarily know that because we haven't built it on scale. And one thing investors do not like to see is anything that could kill someone. And so I think
Unless
that
you're in DOD.
they don't really like to kill people, unless it's the enemy, I guess, but they don't like to kill their own employees, that's for sure. So the risk is maybe not, has not been reduced enough. But again, it could be reduced enough for a remote location. So, and John maybe can also address what more human factors research has been done to take away that fear and that risk that's associated with space-based solar power.
John?
So another development since 2007, it's been really amazing how fast the field has moved.
Yep.
So it's moved drastically in the last 10 years, 8 years, not much less 12. In particular, 10 years ago, the idea of wireless energy, wireless power was still something that was very unusual in regulatory circles. Talking about it always engendered pushback. And today, there is in fact an entire wireless energy industry with multiple industrial associations all selling one kind of or another, made up of companies all selling one kind of or another of components going into wireless energy devices. If you've gone into a Starbucks that has one of those Apple charging tables, that's wireless energy. So that particular kind of wireless energy is magnetic induction based, but nevertheless, it didn't exist 10 years ago, and now you see them popping up here and there. Similarly, there's a lot of technical work and development of relying on things like wireless power transmission for transponders and for data interrogation. Every time you go through a fast track automobile scanner going through a toll road and a toll plaza and it just opens up, that in fact is wireless power transmission from the thing up above. It doesn't depend on you providing power to the box on your windshield. It sends power to the box on your windshield and to you and your face and everything that's in front of it, charges it up, and then it responds. It sends your data to the reader, and on and on and on. So in the last handful of years, there's been this enormous deployment of RF energy and magnetic energy-based devices, wireless devices throughout society. I think probably the biggest studies that have been done, other than studies specifically for wireless power for solar power satellites, which have included looking at effects on plants and multi-generational genetic studies, all of which have found no genetic effect. They do find that the plants tend to dry out a little bit when you put them under a hot microwave. Not a big surprise. Low-intensity studies with various mammals, including primates, have been done internationally, not to my knowledge in the U.S., although I don't know everything that's going on behind the curtain. But most of the studies that have been done and most of the data that have been published actually concern these microwave generators that we constantly hold up to our brains, which are just about the same wavelengths. And interestingly, what these studies have discovered is there is no mutagenic effect per se, not like in the sense that ultraviolet radiation causes the breaking of electron bonds and therefore can cause mutations in skin cells. But you do see radio heating of the tissue near where you hold the phone. And to the extent that if you've ever boiled an egg, you know that heating it up to boiling temperatures causes chemical changes in the egg. I mean, it cooks. So even very, very low intensity will cause heating in the tissues in your head. And so the big issue is whether or not that heating causes some kind of damage. I will say that this is actually much higher than you would get from wireless power transmission from a solar power satellite. But the studies are definitely ongoing. But I'm going to venture to say probably everybody in the room has at least one wireless device that is right now communicating with a mothership someplace out in the ether.
And maybe on your heart.
And it may be in your heart as well. So there's a lot of research that's gone on, a lot of studies, both focused on solar power satellites and on electronic wireless devices. I think I think the jury is still out about the long-term effects and whether or not there's a statistically significant increase in risk, but there certainly is an ongoing topic.
Taking everything you've said into account, nevertheless, the fact that Eva Jane, who worked on the study with you, is not aware of all of that, and certainly...
I'm kind of aware of what he was just saying, but I hadn't been aware of specific, like as far as phones are concerned.
You aren't aware of all the details. And certainly the average investor will be much less aware of that.
Yes.
So, I mean, what do we need to do to convince people?
Well, I think that there's two other factors, and one of them I would say is what I would call substitution issues. And so people who might, or countries or projects that might be interested in space-based solar power, if they have a lower hanging fruit type of example of how they can access it, they're going to go with that before they spend the type of money involved in doing this. Now,
Windmills.
Wind, solar farms, other things, but things that there's, you know, the expression about how many known unknown knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns and everything like that is really true. You just don't know when you've got a massive construction project like this and a heck of a lot of pieces this size, how much it's going to actually cost to do something. You have projections, but you won't know until you actually do it. Until one is done, investors don't have the confidence. So to have someone take that risk to do it, they have to have a very strong motivation for it. So, I mean, I know that there's talk in China, and they may have a higher motivation to do it because you have been depending on coal, and the environmental associations with coal are much more detrimental to the world as a whole, and they're getting lots of flack for it. So they have other kinds of motivations that are not exclusively financial. So the substitution, what are the other motivations? There's a Nietzsche quote that I think is so valid when I think of space and investing, and that's, "He who has a strong enough why can bear any how." And so you have to think about why you want to do this, and if it's compelling enough, like Elon wanting to go to Mars because of the survival of the species, if it's strong enough, then you're going to find a way to do it. But if it's not strong enough, then you're just not going to put in the effort to do it. And I think that space-based solar power has suffered from not a strong enough why.
So is this something that's going to take another Uber angel like Elon or Jeff Bezos?
Well, if I could jump back in. So I think it's worth noting for those of you who may not be aware, that at this moment, over the next 5 years, there are currently planned upwards of $600 million in government space solar power investments, both in the US and China and in Japan. South Korea is now starting a small program in space solar power as well, and there have been industry investments most dominantly by Northrop Grumman over the past several years, working with researchers at Caltech. So although it may be true that you can be skeptical, but nevertheless, there are really, compared to the past studies and the past activities, there are quite significant investments. And although I think it still is at the stage where capital has to come from angel investors, I don't think it still requires archangels, if I can use that term, which I like. Sort of like Jeff Bezos is an archangel.
So Jeff is not, I want to correct
Well, in
something.
terms of cash, in
I want to
terms of
correct
cash.
something. So I don't know if people saw when Chris was presenting, he used the term philanthrocapitalists, and other people have been referring to Elon and Jeff Bezos as angels. These men are not angels, okay? They are not angels. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't think
They're
they're
doing
the
it
opposite.
themselves.
But they're doing it themselves for reasons that they believe in. And they're the entrepreneurs themselves in these endeavors. An angel is somebody who, like I am an angel. I have made space investments, and I'm not
false modesty
I'm not a space angel. I don't belong to their network, but I have made personal space investments on my own with my own money. And I am not part of the company. I'm not on the board of directors. I am just putting my money in things that I believe in and that I think will, and people I believe in, and endeavors that I want to see become successful. And that's what an angel does as opposed to someone like Elon or Jeff.
So how would you classify venture capitalists?
So venture.
Just to get the
Yeah, no, and this is one of the other things that I was thinking as we were going through the program yesterday, is people would say, well, we're going to get the money from this and that, and I think you don't really know how it works. So there's a few things. So the first thing is, in space, it tends to be one of three sources. It could be the financial community. It could be bootstrapping, which is effectively selling products and building the business by yourself, which a number of space companies have done successfully. And it could be government financing through grants and SBIRs and all kinds of other types of investments. That one being the one that most of the time when people say we need investments, they seem to be thinking about it. But if you're talking about financial investments, it pretty much starts with friends and families and your own money. So there are people who just need their own money, that they have enough to do it, but most cases you have to go outside of yourself. Then angels is usually the next level, and an angel may invest up to several $1 million, but not usually beyond that, unless they're an archangel. That's an interesting term, but there aren't very many of them. Then a venture capital fund. They are investing other people's money. This is not their money. This is really important to remember. And they have a timeline. Most VC funds have a fund, like a mutual fund, and it has a life of usually 10 years. So they want to see the ability to exit from all of their investments within 10 years. Now, they usually hope that they have one home run out of 10, and as a result, even if the other 9 companies go bankrupt, they're still going to have positive returns for their investors. But they are investing other people's money, and they have a limited time frame. An angel, in a lot of cases, does not have a limited time frame. Yes, they'd like to maybe sell the investment at a profit, but a lot of the time they're in there for the long term because they want to see that endeavor succeed. And then you start getting into publicly traded companies and things like that, of which there are not that many space examples. So that's kind of the hierarchy you see on the financial side. So if you're trying to raise $70 billion or something that we heard about earlier, you're going to have a challenge because VCs will not put in $70 billion individually. A number of them might. Angels rarely have that. And then the other thing is then you might have somebody who's more of more philanthro than capitalist. So a philanthropist, and I think Paul Allen is the best example, but he's also an example of the risks associated with it. Just a little aside, but it brought it to, and sorry, Erica, I said this to you earlier, but I was just in Barcelona, and I mean, if you know who Antoni Gaudi is and the things that he created in terms of architecture, it's like unbelievable. And he was well ahead of his time. And he had a sponsor for a number of his projects who died about 2 years into his projects. So these projects were never finished. And his kids said, yeah, no, I'm not really interested in this, and the dream died. So one of the challenges with philanthropists or angels is that the dream dies with that generation.
So if you had to estimate on a scale of 1 to 10, your degree of optimism about space solar power, where would you put it?
John or me?
Yeah.
You. Well, each of you, in fact.
Do you want to go?
Well, sure.
John, I know is a 10, but.
Yeah, so
but you know why.
my thought on this is when I've seen the economic numbers for space solar power, there's usually an extrapolation to high launch rate, and that extrapolation brings the launch cost way down, which makes it economically viable. And so there's a very large scale deployment involved, and then you get a return on the investment. And so it requires a very large investment over a pretty significant amount of time. And so I personally am a little bit skeptical, but I'm interested and would love to see it work. But there's another factor that makes me, so it's not my field of work. And the other reason I'm not completely tuned into the topic is because if it works, then it's still just Earth industry. You know, it's Earth building stuff, launching stuff, supplying Earth's needs, and it's not funding settlement. So, but there's another way to go about it, which is put a supply chain in space and then build the space solar power satellites using space resources. And I think that will work in the long run for sure, whether or not the other one works, whether or not launching everything works. But it'll be a longer time scale to get there. So that's my perspective on space solar power.
So I still believe in it. Yeah, the Kool-Aid's not out of my system, but it's not anywhere close in my opinion. I actually think we might see lunar solar power before we see solar power beamed to Earth. So I'm not ruling it out. I think it's quite possible. I think that there may be situations where it's the best alternative and the most commercially viable. But there's so many substitutions and potential substitutions coming online that it could never happen. I don't know for sure.
Well, that's a couple
Do
of
I get to
interesting
answer?
questions for you, John. I mean,
Thank
do we want to launch these systems from Earth, or does it make more sense to consider using lunar materials? And secondly, instead of doing space to Earth, perhaps it makes more sense to start off doing space to space or space to the moon or vice versa?
So at the moment, the way I have gone in my thinking is that it's always unwise to stack too many miracles together and hope that you draw the ace high flush right next to the royal flush, right next to the four kings, etc. And although those things can happen, they are relatively unlikely. And so stacking solar power satellites with large-scale lunar industry, which is done for other reasons with lunar manufacturing, has always struck me as a multi-miracle problem. Launch was very similar in my thinking, but we happen to have two straight flushes now underway, one here in Washington, the other one down in California. Blue Origin and SpaceX are now developing very low-cost launch architectures for their own reasons of vision. As a consequence, that is probably the single biggest change in national thinking about cislunar space that could possibly have occurred. It is the reason for all of the debate and discussion about Space Force. It is the reason for the moon rush. The idea that doing ambitious things in cislunar space is about to become vastly more affordable is causing a radical change in national thinking. Because of that, solar power satellites launched from Earth delivering power on the order of 20 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Still not competitive with baseload in the US, but actually cheaper than baseload power in much of the South Pacific for 1 billion people, becomes really interesting, and at launch prices of about $1,500 a kilogram. I think that when such things occur, and I'll just remind you all that right now, we, the United States, are spending on the order of, are planning to spend on the order of $400 to $500 million on space solar power over the next 5 years. The Chinese, another 200 million, the Japanese, another 100 million. So that's already in plan. When the first solar power satellite starts to go up, then the industrial development of lunar resources becomes inevitable because, in my view, it is the ultimate market for material resources from the moon, whether or not it's fuel or aluminum or silicon or whatever it is. But I think A has to precede B. So I think the market has to be in the process of being established, and then you can justify the investments in developing the material resources of the moon, not necessarily for creation of soil and water for tactical use in the next few years.
The other thing, Ed, is that once the first, Coyote used to describe it as lighting a Christmas tree. And once the first power is beamed and people actually see that it's a reality and that, let's say, a little country in the South Pacific is getting all their power from it, and the advantages of increased cheap power supplies that brings to the society will make other people much more interested in getting the same, and the market will start to develop as a result of that.
Okay, so since you mentioned Colonel Coyote Smith, I know a few years ago that there was a fair degree of interest in developing relatively small-scale space solar power, not 2 gigawatts, but smaller amounts for tactical military needs. You have a base somewhere in some remote part of the world which is not easily supplied with diesel fuel to run generators. It might be useful for the U.S. military to be able to beam power to that site. I haven't heard anything about that recently. Is there anything going on there? Is there still interest in that?
So that, in fact, is one of the foundations of the U.S. Defense Department investment in space solar power, the idea that it has utility in that kind of application. I will just also mention that there are other places where potential markets on the order of 50 to, say, 50 megawatts to 200 megawatts with price points, levelized cost of electricity price points on the order of 50 cents or to $1 per kilowatt hour are of interest. For example, a small country in the South Pacific in the picture behind me, which is, you may have heard of it, it's Australia. So Australia is right over there, has a population of 25 million, and it pays about 3 times as much for electricity, and they have substantial mining activities in the center of the outback, 1,000 kilometers from any power grid, that are utterly dependent on trucking in vast amounts of diesel fuel. And in fact, I am now undertaking, by way of economics and a small personal business plug, I'm now undertaking a partnership in Australia to try to do the first solar power satellite for and from Australia. And that would be a partnership between Australia and the United States. And it's precisely because it fulfills this combination of sweet spots that gets you past a demo. Demo is absolutely necessary, but a demo is on the order of 50 to 100 kilowatts. And it gets you into multi-megawatts to hundreds of megawatts delivered for a market that would pay a premium. And so I actually think this is an extremely promising prospect and quite new.
Okay, I see someone waiting to ask a question. So at this point, we'll take a few questions on space solar power if anyone has them before we move on to other topics.
Okay, I just wanted to follow up on that point. Sorry for my voice. But closer to home, of course, Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, I think their cost of electricity is in excess of 30 cents a kilowatt hour. I think in some instances even close to 50. The problem there, of course, is the massive corruption. So in that regard, I think Australia, where there's better rule of law, might even be better. But I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that fully. And the other issue is that because of the financial difficulties in and around Puerto Rico, et cetera, they really don't have the capital to pay for even a modest 4 or 5. Well, you could do a rectenna in the offshore. You'd have to put it offshore. You couldn't put it on the island. But it's got a significant barrier, and they can't capitalize the project. In Australia, you have a remarkably rich society per capita, about 60% of the population of California, but with something on the order of a $3 trillion sovereign wealth fund into which all Australians pay 10% of their annual income each year. And that's all looking for things that it can be invested in. And they're the reason why things like Gilmore Space exist, is because these sources of money have been applied to creating new industries in and around Australia. So it's got a tremendous financial advantage. But I certainly think after the first one goes up, that then all the islands in the Caribbean, or Caribbean if you prefer, are terrific markets. It's 40, 50 cents a kilowatt hour down there in many places.
Okay, over on this side.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about line loss. I mean, probably a lot of us in the room know that about a little bit more than half of power generated in North America is lost in transmission before it can get usefully put to work. So is there, or has anybody done any work on how much of the microwave power would get lost in the atmosphere and effectively heat it up?
Yeah, so that really comes down to the question of spectrum and choosing wisely. So at wavelengths of on order 10 or 12 centimeters, the losses in the atmosphere from all types of interactions, including with the gases in the atmosphere, with water vapor in the atmosphere, which is, of course, a type of gas, water particulates, et cetera. All of those losses combined, coming down from space at about 10 to 12 centimeters, are less than 1%. So it's a trivial loss in terms of the food chain. The end-to-end from the onboard, the platform voltage, down to Earth, through the atmosphere, into the receiving rectenna, should be on order 60%. So you have to do better. You have to be able to withstand in your economic models a loss of about 40% of the generated power on the platform. But that is actually quite tractable when you. It's not like most of that's in space. And no, it's almost all in the devices. So almost all in the devices.
John, what?
It becomes heat, and either but the interaction with the Earth's atmosphere and the heating of the Earth's atmosphere is minuscule.
So John, what about rain? What about cloud cover?
Yeah. So again, it's because the wavelengths are on the order of my hand, and rain and droplets are typically much smaller. The interactions with rain and cloud cover are minuscule. That's the 1%. If it's a clear, dry day, it's not even 1%. But if you do have heavy rain, like torrential downpour like we had a couple of nights ago, you can get losses on the order of 3 or 4%. But it's still very modest. But you can't go to the higher frequencies. You start going to 1 centimeter or less, and then i.e., when your wavelengths are on the scale of the droplets, then the interactions become extremely potent, and the beam goes away.
Dallas?
Yeah, so John, given your picture behind you,
Yes.
how many elements would it take to demonstrate that you could build this robotically, combining both the platform and the reflectors and the tower? What would you have to do to demonstrate you could build it independent of how much power, if any, that you wanted to generate?
Right. So our current plan is to do a ground demo, ground prototype, including assembly tests, do a series of small experiments, hopefully in space, including space assembly, do a demonstration in low Earth orbit of a system on order, I would say 100 meters, and probably on order 200 to 500 elements, depending on the budget. And then if that is successful, and that would include building it up, tearing it apart again, reconfiguring it, i.e. playing with it, to show that you can do it and go through all the normal concept of operations that bless you. That would be required. Then, at least at the moment, we believe that that gives you the foundation to go to this first full-scale but smaller, i.e. 10% scale prototype.
So could you do that with a single launch? Could you demonstrate enough modular buildup with a single launch of any launch vehicle?
Really budget-driven. You want to launch it as a box of toys,
Right.
And the ideal case would be 2 launches. Because you'd like to be able to demonstrate that you can do your concept of operations, because a big platform is going to take a lot of launches.
Sure.
So you want to be able to demonstrate initial deployment, then bring up a second vehicle, rendezvous and dock, and then unpack the second toy kit.
Okay, thanks.
What's the availability of the frequencies that you need for transmission? And is that a factor to consider to get that bandwidth?
Yeah, so spectrum is the #1 regulatory issue after assuring health and safety for people and fauna. I think it will be proven that this kind of technology is wildly safer than, say, windmills for most types of raptors and bats and so on. And certainly, since windmills cause cancer, a bad joke, I apologize. But at any event, spectrum is absolutely the #1 issue. There's a question that's actually been raised to the International Telecommunications Union, which is the regulatory body that decides such things. And it's a little more complex than it looks, because it's not only the spectrum for the power transmission per se, but also antennae re-radiate in what are called harmonics. So if you're transmitting at one frequency, then at half of that wavelength, you'll get a re-radiation, and at a quarter of that, you'll get another re-radiation. And so you've got to build the receiving antenna such that it dampens those things out so that they don't interfere with others. This is all work that needs to be done for the specific engineering. There's been a lot of research done over the decades, but it's going to be a matter of an international group actually wanting to persuade the ITU and voting in the ITU to get spectrum allocated to make this happen. But I think it's a tractable problem, but it is absolutely one that's going to require at least 4 or 5 years to solve.
Are there any places in the world where there is more available, or is this truly a global thing where it doesn't matter where you put it?
There's certainly a global question, but I actually think Australia is rather attractive because it has no immediate neighbors. I mean, doing it in Germany when you're surrounded by other countries and different regulatory regimes and all of that is certainly far more complex from the standpoint of spectrum allocation than doing it in the outback, where the next nearest user is 1,000 kilometers away. So I think that's actually a very attractive argument in favor of doing it in a large but physically remote part of the Earth.
Okay, thank you.
I think that as you know, actually, I think that the software problems of constructing and operating this thing is going to be quite difficult. And the geometry probably is going to need some real work. Do you have a software team on this, or is that something to be put together in the future?
Still to be put together. We formed the joint venture 2 weeks ago.
All right. I think we've done a pretty good job of hashing out the space solar power question. As I said, we don't want to fall back into the trap of having a potential single point failure. So we don't want to put all of our eggs into the space solar power basket. So we need to ask ourselves, what other possible markets are there that might help sustain and develop a space settlement program. Phil Metzger, I know that you have some ideas about large internet platforms.
Sure. And John, I don't know if you remember this, but you and I talked about this concept back when Deep Space Industries had their announcement party in Santa Monica. And we talked about this, and you said that would be space solar power version 1.0.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what we're talking about would be having large phased array antennas to do multi-beam forming for communication systems. Because when you have a large array like that, you can phase the transmitters to give you a nice narrow beam for transmitting power, but you can additionally put a summation, a superposition of different signals into that antenna at the same time. And you could have one data stream have one set of phasing and another data stream have another set of phasing, and you can end up sending beams in multiple directions, and each beam has a different data stream. And with a large enough array, you could have 100,000 beams, each with a unique data stream. And that would be a new concept for communication satellites, because right now, the reason we use fiber optics instead of comm satellites for the most part is because the communication satellites can only make a beam spot so small. And once you have painted the Earth with beam spots and you've got one data stream in each beam spot, that's it. You can't do any more data using the current concept. But if you take into consideration that you could have multiple directions from each beam spot, with phased arrays on the ground and in space, then you can get 10 to the 5 times more data passing through our atmosphere. So 5 orders of magnitude increase. And that would make comm satellites actually better than fiber optics. So right now, we're, according to the Royal Society, which met in London in 2016 to discuss this, they said we're within a decade or two of the capacity crunch, where you've increased the amount of data you can shove through fiber optics to its maximum level as dictated by physics, by Shannon's law. And now the only way you can increase data transmission is by putting down more fibers on the Earth. And so because data transmission is roughly doubling every 18 months, you double it, and then you double the number of fibers again, and then you double it again, and then you can't build the ships fast enough to double the number of fibers on the world. And so you reach the capacity crunch where fiber optics are no longer adequate to transmit all the data in our world. And so what comes after fiber? You know, this is the Moore's law coming to an end for fiber optics. After one Moore's law ends, you have to go to another technology. And so this would be a possibility, the version 1.0 of space-based solar power, where it's probably the same technology that you're describing right now, just maybe different wavelengths, but a lot of common technology there. And also, there's a lot of interest in putting server platforms off the Earth. Everybody's asking, why did a blockchain company buy Planetary Resources? I've had conversations with several blockchain companies, and they're being cagey about it. But there's an issue about getting outside the reach of people that would hack their servers, or national governments that would grab their servers. There's an issue about energy, getting outside the Earth's shadow for energy for your server platforms, and looking to the future. Eva Jane, you probably have things to say about this.
So I think it's interesting, but I think that it too, well, first of all, I'm not sure if it would drive settlement, you know, if that's a question that you're asking. But I think that the timeline for it is actually considerably longer than one might think, and that there may be substitutions that make it irrelevant at some point in time.
Such as?
I don't know.
Well, Phil, do you want to respond to the point about whether or not this will drive settlement?
Well, so I liked John's answer. When I said I'm a bit skeptical about launch costs getting too low, you pointed out that it's not a uniform market. Current launch costs are adequate for parts of the world for space-based solar power. And I like answers that are not just a simplistic answer. The economics is not simplistic. And so if you put space-based solar power in orbit, then it becomes an opportunity to develop mining and manufacturing in space to support it, right? Derivative markets and extrapolations. So I think putting data off planet Earth is going to be similar to that. I think that it may be decades in the future before it becomes a primary driver. But as niche markets start to develop, then there will be business opportunities developing to support those niche markets, and the entire space-based economy will develop together.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So for something completely different, I loved the talk, and I don't see the professor, the person who made the talk about biospheres, plants and agriculture in the previous. There she is. You're standing. So I love your talk. And my answer to this question at the moment is that the number one product, which is driven by the geopolitical demand for human presence beyond low Earth orbit and across this lunar space and on the moon, is going to create an opportunity to do things that reduce the cost of that human presence. And space tourism will also, when the low-cost transportation comes along, will also then drive the demand for, drum roll please, soil. I think soil is going to be the cash crop, literally, because being able to have biologically viable, habitable volume in which you can have a naturally regenerative, ecologically designed life support system that both processes your wastes and creates your food stocks and your air supply and so on is going to be the ticket to affordable human presence of any kind. And that's going to mean soil. And I don't know how many of you own homes, but unless you purchase that home, or your family purchased that home decades and decades ago, I believe it is very unlikely that if you look at the title that you acquired when you bought your home, whether or not you own the subsurface. Most people who have bought homes in the last N decades purchased surface rights, including possibly the right for a basement. But if its oil is discovered underneath your house...
That's not soil.
No, but let me finish. You don't own it. Well, similarly, I don't think it's really any barrier at all that sovereign countries cannot declare ownership of pieces of the moon, because I think almost anything we want to do with the moon, like make soil, create habitable volume, and so on, depends upon processing and modifying what we find locally. And as a consequence, once you've caught the fish, you own the fish. You don't have to own the ocean. So I think that, in fact, it's no barrier at all to the development of really substantial property rights on the moon and from near-Earth objects in the property that you've modified. So I will make that argument and just throw out there soil. What you want to be putting together is a business plan to make soil as fast as possible. Because it's going to take time.
Okay. A couple of very valid points and a little far-fetched in another way. But it brings back to a conversation yesterday that I wanted to touch on. First of all, if you think, U.S. is not as big, I mentioned yesterday, that Canada is a much bigger mining country than the United States is, and most of the mining is done on crown land. And, I mean, we use the term crown land, but I think it's actually used in the States as well. So crown land is land that the government owns, but they give the federal lands, okay. And they give the mining companies the right to the reserves, but they don't own the land. So that, to me, is exactly the way it would be on the moon. You don't own the land, but you have the property, you have the right to extract and the right to, and yes, I think you're right, most people don't own they own their soil, but they may not own
regolith
20
underneath.
plus feet down or 100 plus feet down, but I'm pretty sure they own their soil. I own my soil in my garden. But if they discovered oil under it, I'm not sure I have the rights for it. But that brings, and for sure, you need agriculture. There is no question, you need agriculture. There's a professor at the University of Guelph who does a considerable amount of research, like you do, on and has a number of experiments up on the ISS as far as agriculture is concerned. You know, one of the things that especially being in Seattle, you know, the first time I heard Blue Origin's motto, I thought that was the best motto for a company that I had ever heard, and particularly in the space industry where the focus is so often on giant leaps. Let's do another giant leap. Let's call our conference the next giant leap. But the way you make progress is with small steps. Ferociously or gradually or determinedly or boldly, but it's small steps. And I think it's really important to think about settlement in terms of what other steps need to be developed before settlement. Tourism, I think, and space stations, but space stations that are not maybe permanently habitable, are. And there's something else about space stations, plural, that I think is important to consider. It means that the more people, other than the limited number that Jim has interacted with that are in space for a certain period of time, the more they're going to look at solving some of the human factors issues to make it a longer time frame. But when it's just the guys with the right stuff or the girls with the right stuff, you know, it doesn't actually inspire most people to the same extent. But I think that, so you think about what are the incremental steps and the small steps that need to be developed. And the fact that Elon and Jeff are working on transportation, that's for sure. You need infrastructure and you need transportation systems. If you couldn't sail to the New World, there's no way you could settle in the New World back in the day. You know, the boats weren't big enough. And so once they could sail and they were confident they weren't going to go off the end of the world, then potentially they could come here and see if they wanted to stay. But I think that the small steps are really important to consider. And I could launch into a thing about space stations, but I don't think we have time.
Okay, we've discussed space solar power and large internet platforms. What other markets should we be considering for large space habitats?
Well, I think we've touched on this several times over the last 2 days. I think that geopolitical and military considerations are going to be important, and I think they're going to be early. The United States maintains an army base on the South Pole, and we don't have any economic advantage by keeping an army base on the South Pole. The reason, and there's really very little military advantage to having an army base on the South Pole. The reason we do it is because there are a lot of nations that have territorial claims in Antarctica, but we have a treaty where they've all set those aside as long as the treaty's in force. All those territories come together at the South Pole, so by putting one army base right there, we are infringing on everybody's claim at the same time. And so if anybody wants out of the treaty, they're going to have to tell us to move our army base. And so by maintaining it there, we are saying that you can't do that without talking to us first.
Oh, actually, that's not an Army base, it's National Science Foundation.
thought
Maybe there's
McMurdo
something else
Station
we
isn't
didn't
at the.
know.
I think the Army, though, I think it's military that actually runs the generators and transports the fuel across the ice and keeps it operating. So
Anyway.
in the same way, I think if we want to keep other nations from carving up the moon and from creating policy in space without us influencing it, we have to be there. I'm saying we as a U.S. citizen, but it applies equally to every nation. So if you want to influence policy in space over the coming decades, you've got to have a presence in space. And I think supporting the effort to influence policy is a business opportunity for companies. If you want to land repeatedly on the moon, you're going to want a landing pad. And so there's going to have to be a company that builds landing pads on the moon, for one example.
So it may be like the Old West where you have the fort and the civilian settlement right next to it.
Yeah.
That would be a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. No
Yes,
military bases on the moon.
Yes, it would.
Under the OST.
Right,
Well-
but it doesn't have to be a military, this is why NASA went to the moon, was to influence geopolitics, but to do it in a civilian way so that we could force other countries into the Outer Space Treaty and get them to stay in it.
A military base on the moon would be a violation. A military base at L5 would not be.
It would not.
So another product that I would throw into the mix, other than the one that I recommended, which is soil, I would also add nitrogen.
Nitrogen is a
Nitrogen. We do not survive for long, either as a species or as a biome, without vast amounts of nitrogen. And having a pure oxygen atmosphere at lower pressure has already been proven once to be disastrous in the presence of a spark. And I don't think anyone would ever try to repeat that kind of habitable environment. And nitrogen being essential to life, and not present in any great abundance on the moon, except maybe in the volatiles to be determined.
Well, it's not even that much. There is
little
nitrogen, but it's not that much. But where do you want to get this nitrogen?
I think
Comets?
this is your market for near-Earth objects. You go to near-Earth objects and you bring back large amounts of nitrogen, because without that, and by large amounts I mean tens of tons.
I'm not sure which type of near-Earth object other than comets has a lot of nitrogen, though.
Yeah, so you've got to find them and get it. But nitrogen is another compelling product.
This is important in terms of drivers, but a business is not going to finance that. Okay?
Yes, exactly.
Investors are not going to finance this, and this is one of the problems, by the way, with the conversations about the moon and mining the moon. And I think it's crucial. Water, ice is crucial. It is really hard to explain to someone in the mining industry on Earth, or to investors in the mining industry on Earth, why on earth you're going to look for water.
If you had an O'Neill settlement that already existed, then absolutely, the owner of the O'Neill settlement would want to buy soil and want to buy nitrogen. But, that's like saying, if I had a horse, then I could ride to town.
Well, that was my question, John. Who is the customer for the soil? And by the way, there is no property rights issue there. If you can crunch up lunar regolith for water, you can certainly do it to make soil.
But you need nitrogen.
The customer for the soil.
Who is the customer? Because this is an economic.
The customer for the soil is the farmer. As soon as you have farmers in space, that you will have a market for soil.
But you were not proposing this as an export to Earth.
Oh, no, absolutely not. No. This is picks and shovels for the local economy.
That would be way beyond coals to Newcastle.
Yeah, by far. No, please.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've got a comment and two questions. One comment, let's get rid of it first, was back to why the hell did a blockchain company buy Planetary Resources? Well, my theory is it's just an opinion. It's very, very simple. Basically, in future, considering who owns what in space, well, you have to establish a system. And blockchain is not only for cryptocurrencies. Blockchain is used. Well, I'm from IT. Blockchain is used in, for example, forestry, for certificates of quality of certain types of wood. They were grown in that and that way, in that and that region. And once you start to sell this wood, you need to keep the certificate in a way that's unchangeable, so that someone can't say just, well, I also grown this high quality wood, without really doing so. So it's about something like certificates of quality, certificates of ownership that can't be changed or cheated upon by any party, and it's totally decentralized. So you don't have to have United Nations to be the one who provides this safe system of information. And this might be something for the future to look into when you consider the rights of ownership of asteroid and the metals that were derived from it once you take it apart, to simply put this information into a blockchain, and well, then it lives on and it can't be changed and can be taken into smaller parts, like these tons of material that you get from an asteroid, and basically, so basically, you needs to combine the know-how of a blockchain company and the know-how of a planetary resources extracting company, to understand how to do this, how to start this. So maybe they just were looking for food into the door and of this future business. If they are the first one who's gonna do it, it's gonna be the Bitcoin is the most known cryptocurrency because it was the first one, So.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, and I got a question back to the solar power plants. Well, one thing, did I catch it correctly that it's 600 billion in US dollars planned between the different countries?
Million.
Million?
Million, not
Million.
billion.
Okay, I was billions. I was just
No. Million.
Okay. That sounds more.
It's a big
reasonable.
plenty.
Yeah, that's anyways a big plan. Yeah, and much more than
Dr. Evil.
before. Considering that basically. You can beam down energy, or you can beam down, communications like internet, yeah. But you can't beam down materials. Is there something in this scope considered for some crazy plan of testing a space elevator to get down materials? Because then it might be feasible to take apart an asteroid and take down the materials. Otherwise, you can use the materials only for space construction.
Yeah. Space elevators are really hard.
I know, I guess.
So indefinite future hard.
The problem
Okay.
with space elevators, beyond the technical problems, is the economics. The throughput rate on a space elevator is very small because you wait for the elevator to go down, you have to wait for it to come back up again. You can only make so many round trips. Each round trip takes, depending on the design, usually it's about 2 weeks. The reason space transportation is so expensive is not because of the propellant. Propellant is almost dirt cheap. It's the capital required to build the rockets. What the space elevator does is to get rid of that propellant cost, which is the small component already, in exchange for an even larger capital cost.
Okay.
Somehow that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay. And just a thought, will it be economically viable to just let the materials rain down on a region like deserted region of Canada and then just mine it from the surface? Because that's the easiest way how to mine materials. Is it too crazy?
First of all, I'm not really quite sure where you're coming from, but if you want to look at it one way, all of the most valuable mines in Canada are asteroidal materials or the result of an impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I
But
mean. Just,
having said that, no one will, the idea of materials being dropped is, totally unacceptable on so many levels. It would never happen.
I think NORAD would object for starters.
Yeah.
Dennis, do you have a question?
I believe she was ahead of me.
Well, I just had a very last question considering the building of solar plants. How much of consideration was put into 3D printing them and parts of them?
So certainly, one of the things which makes a near-term prototyping so much easier and cheaper than it would have been previously is that so much of the structural system, especially of these, it's not up there now, but of these modular approaches, you can simply make a design, print the physical objects, play with them, improve it, redesign it, and then do it again, and then do the prototyping. And so for rapid prototyping during the first 2 or 3 years, to get to the point of having the design that you want to take to space, additive manufacturing is absolutely in there.
Printing them right in space then?
So the issue with 3D printing in space, other than, for example, on the moon, of printing pieces out of lunar materials on the moon, please forgive me, is time. What you really want to do is, once you've made a commitment and you've raised the capital and you're beginning to build a solar power station, you want it to be operational and generating revenue as soon as possible. And at the moment, 3D printing, additive manufacturing is still fairly slow. And compared to simply taking pieces out of a box and plugging them together, getting another box and plugging them together, printing each piece is just going to take forever. So
you can 3D print the 3D printers first, and reuse them infinitely.
I'm all in favor of doing it, but on the moon.
So I wanted to add to that the company Made in Space is working on Archinaut, which does in-space assembly of, for example, large antenna systems. And I think their first concept is you launch a bunch of metal and then you assemble it in space. I don't think they're talking about printing the metal. I think they're assembling rods and such. And the reason, so it does take time. I haven't seen their numbers, but they say it makes economic sense because you can package your antenna system into a much more compact space. And so it doesn't save launch mass, but it saves the volume inside that payload shroud. And they've run the numbers and they say that it makes sense. What I like about it is that once you've got that capability, it's not a huge step to then start getting the metal from the moon or from asteroids.
Or from orbital debris.
Yeah, and then delivering those to your construction site. So it's a smooth ramp up to using space resources.
And Rob Hoyt's company, Tethers Unlimited, is also working on a 3D printing system, Spider Knot or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, this is for Eva Jane. A while ago, you made a statement about relative value in investing. And you talked about terrestrial solar and wind power and stuff like that, and lots of money have gone into these sectors, most of it unprofitably. For example, the Ivanpah $1.6 billion solar power generating system in the desert in California has never come anywhere near close to making the money. But a lot of these systems, capacity factor on wind is much lower than what the engineers projected. Very few. The money is always made on the front end by the banks who take the credits, which are the government credits for the subsidies to get these things started. But operationally, they hardly ever make any money. Very few of them do. So the question is perception of risk and value in terrestrial investing versus in space investing, which may have a higher perceived risk, but a lower actual risk versus the lower perceived risk of a lot of these terrestrial energy type investments, but the actual risk is much higher.
So I can't say anything in terms of tax credits because I don't know what they are. But it goes back to the conversation all these years about a demo. And if that brings down the risk and it brings up investor confidence. At the moment, though, I don't think that the investor confidence in the concept is high enough without a demo to some degree of showing it coming down, making sure there's no health concerns. I mean, John can say it, you have to realize that many investors, not all, are definitely from Missouri. Got to see it to believe it. So I think a demo, more than any other thing, could change the dynamics and the interest.
But the question is, most of those investors from Missouri bought hook, line, and sinker stories from terrestrial energy systems that turned out not to be true. That those of us who were engineers ran the numbers and knew that it was never true.
Oh, yeah.
They invested the money into something of
There's so many examples of that, Dennis, in any part of the industry.
I understand, but this is specifically to energy systems. So what we're trying to get to is how to reduce the perceived risk in space versus the actual risk, and to show the investor community who has now been burned by a lot of these terrestrial energy is to how to market to them the difference in the risk profiles.
Yeah, but I think Eva Jane is exactly correct, though, that there have to be demos. It has to be a significant scale demo, and mental blank. I apologize, Dallas. Dallas, now once I tried to address you, I remembered your name. Just went completely out of my head. I was thinking Fort Worth. It wasn't true. Anyway, as Dallas pointed out, you've got to have the demos in order to make it stick, and the demos have to be relevant in terms of the concept of operations.
So we need demos, and we also need very good salesmen.
Well, and I mean, you said actually, Dennis, and somebody else said about stories, and how well you convey the story. And what I find is a lot of the time the story is not well told. The engineer ease that comes out of these presentations, it's like, shut me down. The business plans. When I've been a business judge in so many of the business plan competitions over the years, and we actually read business plans and things like that. It's like, you don't know how to talk to people. You don't know how to talk to people. Now, I don't know about these projects that you were working on or that you were talking about, so I can't comment on them.
I'm talking about major power systems.
Yeah,
That's okay. I'm just talking about.
And remember that I'm Canadian too, so we have lots of hydro, we have lots of wind, we have a little bit of solar. They're mostly in big companies, and you can buy them on the stock exchange. So it's not quite the same thing that I know you're talking about, but I don't know enough of the details to comment any further.
It's not good enough to have a Steve Wozniak. You also need to have a Steve Jobs.
So let's see, 2 or 3 things that were covered. For the business cases, I was kind of curious, could you do what you had talked about, beam the energy down? Because what I run into is I'm working with beyond line of sight drones, but you'd need low latency for C2 to operate them, and then because they become beyond line of sight and they're not on a propellant that is a type of fuel, but electricity like battery, could you do multi-faceted beamforming or a massive MIMO network to allow them to fly and communicate at the same time with the systems you're talking about? Because, let me tell you, working at T-Mobile, they're coming to us saying, we don't want to set up our own network to fly beyond line of sight, and they won't go with the satellite companies because of the high latency, not low latency for C2. Could you solve that for them? Then you've got a use case, and they will pay through the nose.
Mm-hmm. So it's a unique drone application compared to most. So I've got a friend who has started a small company to pursue power beaming 2 drones, and he tried the particular kind of application that you're describing. So long duration flight, communications network application, and so on. The dilemma I think that he ran into is that most drone applications that are in the marketplace have to do with moving a thing from A to B.
Not the ones that I'm partnering.
No, I understand. But most of them do, and the A to B kind of application, or the out and look and then go back applications.
That one.
But they tend to return to something where they can sit and recharge locally fairly frequently, and that's a low-risk technical solution. So as long as you're going from A to B, or you're going someplace and you're going back to someplace where you can recharge, then it tends to dominate the thinking of the investors. He's had a lot of difficulty trying to raise money. He's got a good technology, he's perfectly good business plan, and he's had a tremendous amount of difficulty raising the money to do exactly that kind of application.
Jeff Greason has a new company called Electric Sky, where he's trying to work on something similar to that. However, his concept requires some new applications of physics, which he won't talk about publicly in detail. So no one here can talk about that because we don't know about it.
We do it terrestrially, but I think that that's very limited because we have the spectrum, we have the poles. We do it domestically. You can do internet. Well, we do go Canada, States. But I was just curious if you could help them along because I'm also a drone pilot. And it would be nice just to keep my battery charged so I don't have to come back because for that particular reason, when we have the monitoring drones that go out, because they're flying near our cell towers, they're downloading real time all the data that they're getting before, or they're doing a hot sync with the hard drives, and that's elongating the time that they're out in the field and back. We're doing it real time. Instead of 18 hours round trip to get the data back, it's 18 minutes. So if you could do that by satellite, they pay because their customers pay.
Okay.
Captain Jim.
Yes, sir. So I think we are very good in the space sector for asking the wrong questions. And so I'd like to test a hypothesis, just thinking about the conversation. As we've been launching spacecraft over the last 50 years, the technologies that actually serve the application have been developed on Earth, and usually the core technologies have been tested and deployed and sold in the marketplace for years before. Basically cameras and radios. In space, the spacecraft are so expensive and we see them as such innovative systems because of the layers of reliability engineering and redundancy that is necessary to keep those things operating in an economic model that is viable when you don't have access for maintenance. But the core technologies are cameras, radios, and then the components that support that are processors and other things. So perhaps we're missing something as a principle to Eva Jane's question of how do you go step by step to space settlement, a viable space settlement economic model. It could be that the model we need to apply is we are on a celestial body that is orbiting a star. All of the environments that we need to test, the majority of at least celestial body mechanics, allowing for constants of intrinsic capability and variables of extrinsic environment here on this planet. And so if we extrapolate our experience, from when Marconi kicked off radios and then we launched a radio, to having the ability to have a photosensitive film, to launching a camera, to having mechanical autonomous servos and motors, to launching a rover. And if we start taking that hypothesis of let's build our space settlement technologies here on Earth for customers, let's not try and get clever about economic models or anything. The principles are kind of valid. Human motivations of greed and benign self-interest, the ability or the needs to drive ourselves for growth and sustainability are the drivers. The economic system is the driver, or at least is the mechanism.
Is there a question coming?
Just hang on, Edward. Because if you listen carefully, the principle here is valid. You said we're doing a 2.0 of Space Enterprise Initiative. So let's try and address what does it take to make 2.0. And I think part of the 2.0 mechanism is to elevate our thinking into how can we utilize the economic system that exists here today, and instead of trying to fight it, instead of trying to come up with emotive or philanthropic shortcuts to financing and capitalizing these projects, let's treat Earth as a celestial body, identify the technology requirements, agricultural, mechanical, software, or whatever is required. Identify markets and customers that can give us a return in 3 years and demonstrate viable business, and then extrapolate from that point out into settlement technologies, and the only unknown we have to engineer is the delta for the change of environment. And I think we've been doing that for the last 60 years, but we haven't noticed it. And if we can tease out that dynamic, maybe we can accelerate. It's a point for consideration.
So at NASA, back in the Apollo program and following, we always publicized spin-off technologies as a way to help justify the space program to the public. You know, we're developing all these great technologies, Tang, and Velcro. But then starting around the late 90s or the early 2000s, we started using the word spin in. And that was because the commercial engine of technology development had moved into the relevant domain of space, and the government-funded technology development wasn't able to keep up anymore. And the best example that I know was there was this heat shield that had to be so precise that NASA developed this laser scanner to measure the accuracy, and they built this laser scanner for $10 million. And when the heat shield and the laser scanner were delivered to the Cape, the local technician said, "Why don't you just use our laser scanner? It's better. We bought it for $10,000 commercially." And so NASA learned that we have to spin in technologies by taking and slightly adapting to make them fit the application. So I think that's what you're talking about. So NASA has figured out that spinning in is actually bigger now than spinning off.
And then so maybe we need to take some of that thought process, but emphasize it as almost the starting point. Instead of we're going to build something and then spin in the odd bit. Let's take the spin in of entire matured product and spin that into deployment beyond Earth's atmosphere.
So, Jim, first of all, I think that you got to watch sometimes your questions. They seem so too self-serving, because what you're doing now is definitely working on that. From an investor point of view, if there's dual-use technologies, not military civilian, but space and terrestrial, it's far more attractive to an investor as if it's just space-related. And for many companies who have a space interest, trying to figure out how to survive by having a terrestrial business is the way to go. And so I think it's just happening. It has been happening for years. I don't think it's actually a new thing in terms of maybe nobody's going through and saying this lesson and that lesson and something else. I always hate the term spin-offs. A business coach I know uses the term strategic byproducts, and I think that really says what a lot of the benefits of the space program have been to Earth itself, because really everything has been a benefit to Earth, and there's no big people in space to pay taxes or anything. But I think dual-use technologies, terrestrial applications, and space applications are far more attractive from an investor perspective. So if you're starting a space company, but you can use the technology for something terrestrial, you sure want to do that.
Okay, I'd like to throw out a couple more ideas for the panel to comment on. Maybe some people in the audience have some thoughts on these also. Phil brought up the idea of a sort of a military base model for a space settlement, similar to the Old West, where you'd have the Army base and then the civilian town right next to it. One other model which has been suggested by various people is sort of a spaceport, shipyard exploration base where a settlement might earn its primary income from building spaceships for NASA, for industry. What do people think of that idea?
Well, I think ultimately you still have to have a customer, and so why do you need a spaceport? There has to be something you're doing that's providing value back to the people of planet Earth that's going to motivate them to invest in the spaceport. One of the things that we've historically done is science and exploration. So if you can build spaceports and that will make NASA and ESA and the other JAXA, the other space agencies, more efficient, then maybe we can convince the politicians to build spaceports. And I think that's
Do you mean
viable.
spaceports on Earth, or do you mean spaceports in space?
I mean a spaceport in space.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I think that's viable. I think it will make the agencies more efficient, but it's still a limited market. It's just how much are the governments of the world willing to invest in exploring for the sake of science?
Yeah, and I would just jump into that and say that there has to be a market, but the sine qua non of ports on Earth, that thing without which they do not exist, is a driver for a particular locality. A safe harbor from storms, access to a river, a crossroads between rival regions, something about that location that gives a port a dominant role in the flow of goods and services. And at the moment, the moon is kind of accessible at only 1,800 meters per second from anywhere in lunar orbit. So I don't know, until we get to the point of we've found a really valuable deposit of hydrocarbons along with the water ice. So nitrogen and the carbon and all these great elements that we really want to have from the volatiles from this spot near Shackleton. Until we get to that point, I don't know that there's a driving focus, a locus of activities that would lead to a port. I put in my port near Shackleton, and they'd land 100 kilometers away, and there has to be some economic aspect that compels this location versus others. It makes it difficult.
First of all, I agree with John. When you think of what a port is it's a location, but I want to change it slightly to stations, okay, as opposed to ports, because effectively a port would be a station. And there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about in terms of ports, stations. First of all, there's lots of them being talked about. They're not going to be big. They're going to be small. And Bigelow module, it may be the first one. It may not be the first one, but and some of them may be attached to the ISS before they're free floating. But it's sort of there's a whole theory about, I don't know if anybody's ever studied the network effect and the theories of networks, but when there was one telephone, it was of no use. The two telephones, it's a lot more use. The more there is, the more the network has, the dynamics of how networks work, and cities work, and ports work, and stations could work. If you have several of them with a specialized use, you may get things happening between them, all of which could be space enabling. So when I look at investing, I think I want to see something that's space enabling. So I want to see what could create the next steps. And if you're having some manufacturing that's most successful in space and you so I think of things like space manufacturing and tourism as being the nearest short-term things, but I definitely think that having multiple stations, perhaps in different locations with different purposes and uses and customers to buy the products that they create could be could be an earlier stage than lots of things we've talked about so far.
Well, I believe that the government does have a role to play in bootstrapping industry in space. And
Anchor tenant.
anchor tenant, sure, and incubating the technologies. And I don't think we should underestimate the value of that. We just finished a study at JPL. I'm not going to tell the results. They'll be published in the IAC Congress. But it was a study where we weren't analyzing how to make a mining camp economically valuable. The concept was that it is a good that the government should pursue to learn how to live beyond Earth. And so if that's the goal of your spaceport, to learn how to live in space, then here's a way to do it that would be government-led, and it would incubate technologies, and it'll provide a purpose for Gateway and a purpose for SLS and commercial launchers, and everybody has something to play. I thought it came out really well. So that'll be publicized pretty soon. So I think that's sort of I think that is a role for government, and it will help get industry started. Then the commercial companies have a place to plug in. It makes their business case easier for the startup. NASA becomes an anchor customer.
Yeah. You wonderfully prepared the ground for my question, which was, we talked about lifting nitrogen and water and regolith from moon. We talked about spaceports and drivers as reasons behind those. What about mass driver? We all know that Mr. O'Neill was one of the proponents, if not inventors of the mass driver. I don't think we mentioned it here during those 2 days. Is there any update, maybe from you, Edward, or just any of the speakers on this? Is there some development besides of what we don't know what the Army is doing?
Yeah, so in my own opinion, maglev is much better than coil guns or mass drivers. Mass drivers have the advantage that they're quite compact, but they involve very high accelerations and also very high power density, i.e. they need a lot of kilowatt hours in a very few seconds. Whereas if you have the space to do maglev, which is, if you look at it from the standpoint of maglev, there has been a lot of advance in Japan and in Europe and Germany and so on in the last several decades. So there's a lot of very relevant work for relatively low acceleration, magnetic acceleration, magnetic levitation type systems. In terms of coil guns and such like, there has been work in the Navy, the EMRG program, electromagnetic railgun. It's quite high acceleration, huge capacitor banks for a small projectile as a weapon, not as a payload. The dilemma tends to be that in that case, the electric arc eats the gun. So it's like touching a screwdriver to a live wire, and you get a flare, and a little bit of the screwdriver turns into vapor. I did that when I was a kid. My dad was very unhappy. But there has been work in that kind of system, but it's not really germane to launch because it does eat itself. But I think the point is very well taken. I was thinking about it in the earlier conversation this morning. But I think magnetic levitation type systems with linear synchronous motors are far easier to see how you'd fabricate those from lunar materials in large measure and make them solar powered, and then you'd have essentially $10 a kilogram launch from the moon, which would be very interesting in terms of the economy of a cislunar, the economics of a cislunar infrastructure.
Has research been done in the last decade? Something coming forward, or?
There was work done in the 1960s by a good friend, now no longer with us, on a thing called the Lunatron. Bill Escher did that. And there's been a little bit of work more recently, but not very much. Not very much.
Over here?
So something that I know that I feel that we've kind of been dancing around, but in no uncertain terms, is the terms of supply and demand for economics. And for a budding industry like the space industry, at least I'm of the opinion that demand begets demand. So as we create sort of opportunity where we create solar power for specific markets, that's going to require something else, I don't know, in-orbit service or whatever needs to be done. And so my question is, this is going to open up a lot of opportunities for investors, entrepreneurs, and all of that. And with each major event, like Gateway or a lunar station, or an O'Neill station in the future. But in the future, what do you think that this continual demand will continue increasing? What will be the, if you will, the bumps on the curve?
Demand for what exactly?
Anything related to space?
So I think that actually you heard all the challenges along the way. So there's tons of challenges before you get to that stage. I mean, there's no question that economic activity can breed economic activity, and that, but you know, at the moment, if I would not use Gateway as an example because there's a limited number of suppliers to NASA for that. And so that's not going to really help develop an industry. But it's something that industry wants to see more from the government, is things that enable the development of a diverse and robust ecosystem. And that's not happened yet, and I think it needs to happen. I just want to apologize to Jim for 1 second because that was just such a long-winded question. But Jim is doing something that relates so much to what Jim Logan said in terms of the robotics and using autonomous robots to do various things in development. And I think that after Jim Logan's presentation, I wasn't that keen about robots before, but I really think that robotics is going to be even more important to potentially create any the infrastructure needed before people go to some of these places and before settlement can occur. So in terms of early industries, I definitely think robotics is one, and it has to be autonomous. And with the developments in AI and other things and the work that Jim's doing, I think that those are kinds of things that are really interesting that's happening. I definitely think the ecosystem is lacking. And it's lacking on my side, on the financial side, as well as in so many other areas.
Demand in general will always increase as long as population increases. But if you look at demand in a specific area, you have to be careful. For example, a few years ago, many people were very enthusiastic about XM radio in Sirius. You know, everyone was going to be listening to satellite radio on their cars. But, you know, no one anticipated that there would be things like Pandora. So, you know, now Sirius and XM have merged, and I guess they're still around. I know they're still around. They keep sending me emails every now and then offering.
And that gets to the substitution issue. You know?
Exactly.
So I would like to comment on your observation or your suggestion. In particular, the historical policies that governments have followed tend to suppress the creation of new markets and the opportunities for innovation resulting from government-sponsored space missions. So, for example, we don't think about what could we do with a recycled International Space Station. We think about dropping it safely into the ocean in pieces. But it costs tens of billions of dollars to put into space. It might be deconstructed and refabricated to be something far more useful. Every kilogram of material that is produced by astronauts on the moon is a rich source of nitrogen and water and it should not be lost. It should somehow be preserved. The landers that we land in should not become historical monuments. They should become feedstock out of which some bright young entrepreneur could make a habitat or make a rover. Or so I think one thing that a lot of the actions which are taken by governments can either promote innovation and the creation of new markets, or they can deter it. And so that's something that I think we should be promoting, making whatever it is we do somehow feed forward into new opportunities.
John, I need to correct you on that, because I
I'm gonna
know
drop the
that
station?
I know that engineers at Boeing have talked and looked seriously at the possibility of recycling the material from the space station. But that was several years ago, and Congress has extended the life of the ISS at least twice since then.
And engineers at Rockwell looked at flying autonomous shuttles for cargo missions.
Think of Mir.
So,
I suspect it's probably politically incorrect
Compelled to
for
deal
anyone at Boeing to even think about
there was a
recycling the space station at this point.
but it's 400 tons of really useful material.
Yeah. So
Not in its present form.
But it brings up to what I mentioned in passing, but, the technologies for, first of all, orbital debris issues are really going to be important, and how to reuse these things. I mean, you got the Star Trek scenario, right, that they're going to build spacecraft in, but, we're not there. It's going to be a long time before the Star Trek scenario of building the Enterprise in space is going to happen. But there is resources in space that have just been abandoned, and between salvage law challenges and the fact that there's a lot of countries that don't want anyone touching their dead satellites, this is something that needs to be explored and discussed more, because you might as well use what's already up there.
Well, Eva, I want to challenge when you say it's going to be a very long time until we build a spacecraft in space. If you break
Starship.
a Starship, if you break it down, okay, first of all, it's not rocket science, it's industrial engineering, and all we have to do is adapt it to vacuum and lower gravity. And it's really just an economic problem. How do you put that equipment out there in space and start doing it? We know how to do it. It's not that big of a deal. It's just an economic problem.
I agree.
Right?
So one of the other things that at the ISDC in LA maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, I can't remember, Jeff Bezos talked, and one of the things he said was he envisions all heavy manufacturing being in space at some point in time. And I think the way the environmental laws are going in the world and the concerns of the environmentalists is that may very well come to pass. And so, but you know what? Companies that I've talked to, but the other thing is that I don't know if people are aware of this, and there's one starting up in LA at the moment. John Goff participated in the one in Toronto. In Toronto, there's a University of Toronto School of Business has a sort of like an incubator, but not exactly, called the Creative Destruction Lab, and they had a space stream last year run by Chris Hadfield, or initiated by Chris Hadfield, and it was kind of like a combination of coaching and a little bit of a survivor, because teams got cut along the way. It was a very interesting process. I mean, the companies that were the most interest to the VCs and everybody who were there and the advisors tended to be satellite companies, which is where space investment primarily is going. Not space settlement, nothing space enabling terribly. But there was one company that wanted to do a foundry in space, and I think the way they were going about it was a little bit off, but a lot of people didn't understand what the benefit of having a foundry in space was. But if you can do construction in space, you're going to have to do some of these things and know how it affects different materials and everything. And there's lots of knowledge to be gained in that area.
Well, I have a friend, he has been CEO of space companies, and I won't name him, but he was getting spears thrown at him, like, what's your business model? What's your business case? And he said to me, people always throw these spears at you, but the truth is, if you wait until it's that crystal clear then you're too late, because you've got to get in when it's barely legal, barely ethical, barely technologically possible, and barely economically viable, because if you're not the one doing that, somebody else is, and then they're the first ones in. So I don't know about that. I'm not a business person. I'm an academic person. But the big picture is we are near the beginning of a revolution in robotics. We haven't reached the end state yet. We don't know what it'll be like at the end state, but it'll be a lot different than it is now. Already we have factories that are lights out factories where the workers leave for a month at a time and they're building robot arms in that factory. A month later they'll come in and all the robot arms are finished. We have to, so it's just a matter of putting that in space and finding the economically viable stepping stones to get there.
Okay, we're now about 5 minutes past the official end of this panel, so it's time to wrap up the conference. And before we do, I'd just like to give everyone one last chance to comment on anything they might have heard here over the last 2 days, which they've been just burning to comment on.
You don't want to give that one gentleman a chance to speak who was standing there patiently.
I've got, I think, a brief question. This has been titled the Space Settlement Enterprise Conference. That's supposedly the vision we're pursuing. And over the last couple of days, we've had interesting presentations, we've had some fun, we've met old friends, we've met new friends, but we've also heard that everything of any size in space is going to be done by robots, that anything that we do over the next generation will be launched from Earth, that the major economic drivers we've always recognized in the past are not viable, and therefore the future we've been seeking, in which space settlement occurs, is out generations from now, at best. What are we missing? If this is a Space Settlement Enterprise Conference, where is the space settlement driver? What makes it happen?
Well, that is something that we are working on. That's the big question that we have to answer. And our goal for this year is basically to define what the questions are and what the challenges are. And then we're going to come back next year and the following year and try to solve some of the problems that we've identified at this conference.
I've been coming to these things since 1981. This is the most profoundly discouraging conference I have ever been at on this subject.
That's why I thought this would be the most pessimistic of the things, but then Jim talked first.
Well, I hope that you won't go away discouraged. I'm actually very optimistic because we are at the beginning of this revolution in robotics. Space access costs are still going down. It's easier to do things in space robotically.
And robotics are working for people.
With robotics leading the way, creating environments where it's safe for humans to follow, then we have a path into space. And I have friends like Jim Caravala over here. I believe in his business model. I believe it'll work. And I know of other business models I think will work. I can't talk about most of them. But there are creative people figuring out things along the way.
Yeah.
Okay. Eva, I think you had some things you wanted to mention?
I actually managed to sneak most of them in. I wanted I know I came across negative, but I think I hope I'm coming across realistic, because some of these ideas, to get the money to do them, they have to make more sense. And, the bulk of people, unless they're really motivated themselves by settlement, that's not going to be the driver for investment funds. It has to be something else, unless we have a meteor coming that will destroy Earth, in which case that will change everything on a dime. For sure, settlement will be most important. It won't be on the moon, it'll be farther away, and that's why I truly believe that Elon is driven by that. It's a problem that he sees that needs to be solved, and he's looking at his way to solve it. But I am optimistic. I think this will happen. I just thought it would happen, like Jim said, 20 years ago. And so people often say to me, why are you, you're in the investment industry, why are you going to space conferences and things like that? And it was because at one point in time I just said, maybe there is something I can do, maybe there's something I can do to advance this. And so, I'm here on my own dime, and God knows I've spent lots of them on space conferences in the past, and I'm doing what I can to advance the process. And when I see something that's a near step thing that I can influence or help out in, and or company that I can help out with, I'm prepared to step up and do that. And I think that's all we all can do.
If I may?
So,
John?
So the final observation I would make is to speak to the question of numbers. And Jim Logan mentioned the sort of the requirements for it, Logan's rules or criteria. So I mentioned earlier the absolute transformation that's happened in the last half dozen years in space access, and what a profound impact that is having on the geopolitics of space and space activities, and that the things like the Space Force have come out of the military thinking about what does it mean to be able to get anything into space rapidly and cheaply, i.e., $1,000 a kilogram. I think similarly, when there is access to megawatts of power throughout cislunar space at a dime per kilowatt hour, unlike the space station where you have access to a kilowatt at $50 a kilowatt hour, that's going to be completely transformational. When there is regular access to the moon and so on. So I am in fact not that pessimistic. I think that if you look across the key requirements for really ambitious things happening in cislunar space, including settlement, which will be driven by cultural purposes, I think, not economic ones, but it'll be enabled by economic transformations. I think that is an extremely promising future, and one that's going to be here in the next couple of decades.
Okay, we really do need to wrap this up and get out of here quickly. So let's make these questions very fast.
Right. My daughter just graduated from film school, and half of her class, about 6 people, made science fiction films about the future, shorts. And all of them were dystopian futures. And it struck me that this is what the youth of our generation look to the future as being as high-risk scenario for them. The environment's going downhill. The population's we're going to run out of resources or something. And I think in this conference, if we start thinking or putting our ideas in the context of a future that may be, say, 10 or 20 years out there, and saying, there's many possible futures, but what is the difference between a future that involves space settlement and futures that don't? And then by describing these two alternate paths down in the future, we should be able to identify, a cost to the less desirable outcome. And that cost, if we can sell it to the public as being a benefit of space settlement, should easily fund the projects that we want to see happen. So I think it's really about creating public perceptions about what the futures could be like and what what possible futures exist and how space settlement would affect those futures. If we can do that better, I think we'll attract a lot more people, a lot more interest into investment in this field.
Was there a question?
Nope. That was a statement. You said if there's anything burning you wanted to say,
okay,
up and
fair
say it.
enough.
Short statement. We're going to go into space because for exactly the same reasons that we got out of the ocean and onto land, for exactly the same reason that we left East Africa and spread out over the entire globe, because that is what we do. We are alive and we expand, and if the Gaia is to expand off of Earth, they need somebody like us that can build rockets.
Very good. And on that, I declare the conference adjourned.